If you had been on the Titanic that tragic night, April 15th, 1912, do you think you would have taken it seriously enough, early enough to have survived? Let's compare it with living with chronic fatigue syndrome to see if you would have. Okay guys, I'm not gonna make any bones about it. I'm gonna be super negative in this video because let's face it, I have been in a ton of pain and just in a bad headspace for a while. And with this whole Titan submersible thing happening, everyone's obsessed with the Titanic right now, which I happen to be a huge history buff on the Titanic, and the algorithm will totally reward me for doing this. So you know what? Everyone knows the Titanic ain't a happy subject, so I don't think you're exactly going to expect this video to be cheerful in any way, so why not? Just gonna warn you. Just putting it out there. Don't expect happy, hopeful, happy cheerfulness. Yeah. And on the bright side, I mean, most people understand why the Titanic was such a tragedy, whereas a lot of normies and stuff don't really understand why having chronic fatigue syndrome is such a bad thing to live with. So maybe this will kind of correlate a few things to them and help them understand it better too. You never know.
Jesus, Mary. Iceberg! Dead ahead!
At approximately 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, the Titanic impacted with that famous iceberg. And here's the thing. After it impacted with the iceberg, no one knew of the looming danger. According to first-class passenger Edith Rosenbaum Russell, passengers were even playing with chunks of ice that had rained down from the iceberg onto the Titanic. Playing with them. While it was well known that they had struck the iceberg, most passengers were in complete denial that there was any issue. They refused to believe anything could harm their unsinkable ship. Now, similarly, people with chronic fatigue syndrome, especially when it first starts and they first get diagnosed, are kind of in complete denial about what they have to do to cope with it in their life. They're like, no, I can be normal. No, it's not a big deal. It's not going to get me. I'm not going to end up like those other people that are severe or bedridden. No, it'll never happen to me. Yeah. And the younger you are, the more in this headspace you will be. It happens to most of us. Just like most of the Titanic passengers thought that way. 12:40 a.m. Lifeboat 7 is the very first lifeboat to be launched with only 27 people on it, although it could hold the weight of 65 men. So the ones that got in the lifeboats early on the Titanic, I kind of compare to the two types of people in the early stages of their chronic fatigue syndrome. There is the people on the Titanic who were randomly forced into the lifeboats by their family or by the crew. These are the chronic fatigue syndrome people that randomly recover or learn how to live with it very quickly because they were kind of forced to rest by their family or just happened to be the lucky 5% that spontaneously recovered. It really was out of their control and they just happened to be the lucky ones. And then there are the people on the Titanic that kind of saw what was happening and went with their gut and got onto the boat. This is that rare few of chronic fatigue syndrome people that in the very early stages actually chose to rest and learn to listen to their body very early on instead of fighting it in any way. And they learn to live with it. And because of that, they have a much better quality of life than the rest of us. This is also very rare in the chronic fatigue community. Most people fight it or are in denial or, yeah. Third-class passengers. So while it is a myth that the third-class passengers were actually locked down there, it is true that the order to bring the third-class women and children to the lifeboats wasn't given until 12:30 in the morning. And that was almost an hour after the collision. Only 25% of third-class passengers survived Titanic sinking. This failure by the people in charge kind of correlates to what chronic fatigue syndrome sufferers have to deal with the people in charge of our health.
Here, what do you think you're up to? I'll have you arrested for damaging company's property.
So if you're poor, not only are you too poor to take enough time off to actually rest when you need to, because you have to work to survive, but on top of that, you also deal with medical professionals gaslighting you and holding prejudices against you based on your class, your gender, your race, etc. And all of that makes it really hard to live with this. By 1 a.m., water was seen at the base of the grand staircase in the Titanic. And just like how people in the Titanic did not panic until the very end when it was super obvious that it was going to sink, thanks to denial or whatever, people with chronic fatigue syndrome tend to do the same thing throughout their declining health until it gets to the point where you cannot ignore it anymore. And then, just like on the Titanic, then they start to panic. And just like you can't reverse the sinking of a ship to get onto the lifeboats early, you can't reverse your deteriorating health to have done other things early. You have to stop, you have to work on it now, and do everything you can now. Don't just give up. Work on saving yourself. As the lifeboats were rowing away and the fireworks signals were going off in the air, you could hear those 8 brave musicians playing on the Titanic's deck until the very end. They did this in order to help everyone else, in order to help them not be as afraid, and in order to calm them so that worse problems wouldn't arise from sheer panic. I kind of compare these guys to those of us that are severe, that are doing everything we can to help the rest of you with social media, with blogs, with Instagram, with YouTube videos. We are using our God-given talents to try and help others during this time of chaos. So, as any last hopes of the Titanic not sinking quickly ran out, one man, rather than fighting for space on a lifeboat or panicking in any way, a Mr. Benjamin Guggenheim took off his life vest and changed into his finest evening wear. Accounts from survivors quoted Benjamin as saying,
Mr. Guggenheim, these are for you, Mr. Guggenheim.
Oh, thank you. We have dressed in our best and are prepared to go down as gentlemen.
"We've dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." I honestly think that he is the same as the group of severe chronic fatigue syndrome people that they've calmly just given up on life. It always breaks my heart when I see in my chronic fatigue syndrome groups that someone has officially given up and left this world. And I hear about it far too often, frankly, for my liking. I always think there's hope, and I always think that you shouldn't just give up. And, you know, it's not that they don't have reasons for this. Some reasons are depression, lack of support, or even lack of resources. It's hard to survive with chronic fatigue syndrome in many ways. Now, while I understand it, it still makes me very sad. Around 2:15 a.m. on April 15th, at the time, 13-year-old Madeline Mellinger recalls the final moments of the Titanic from the lifeboat she was on. "I could see the lights of the ship starting to go underwater. Then, soundlessly, perhaps a mile away, it just went down. It was gone," she said. "Oh yes, the sky was very black and the stars were very bright. They told me the people in the water were singing, but I knew they were screaming." One lifeboat returned to try and find survivors in the water, Lifeboat 14. However, its captain, Lowe, had overestimated how long people could last in the freezing waters. He waited too long, and by the time he returned, only 4 people were able to be pulled out of the water, along with 13 people from the sinking Lifeboat A. These rare few are comparable to the chronic fatigue sufferers that kind of did everything wrong. the whole time, but have still managed to live a long life despite having done everything wrong constantly. And related to that, then there are the miracle people, which would be comparable to Titanic's extremely intoxicated baker, Charles Joffin, as 1,500 panicked, freezing souls drowned and froze to death around him. He just paddled around the freezing waters until dawn, despite the water's temperatures being about 28 degrees Fahrenheit and most people having froze to death in less than 45 minutes. Joffin claimed that he survived swimming around for 2 hours until a lifeboat finally pulled him out of the water. He claimed it was because he had drank copious amounts of whiskey before he had jumped off the ship. I find this comparable to those miracle CFS sufferers that are so severe, so bedridden, doing terribly for years. And then, because of random luck or a miracle or who knows what, they are suddenly basically cured after a very long time of having had it. And just like with this guy, many other people will imitate the supplement or the cure they said they did, but the results never seem to work out for anyone else like it did for them. There were other drunk people when the Titanic went down, but for some reason with him it was a different story. Same as with these rare cases of people that have long time severe chronic fatigue syndrome that magically are cured out of nowhere. It's never the same cure. It's never the same thing. And if other people try it, they don't get the same result. They're just a miracle that can't easily be explained. Look, most of us with chronic fatigue syndrome don't make the right decisions because we rely way too much on luck or trying to find miracle cures. And let's face it, this is a sure way to miss the lifeboats. To make sure you catch your lifeboat, I highly recommend you watch this video next, where I talk about why most long-time chronic fatigue syndrome sufferers agree searching for cures is a bad thing and what you should do instead. Sorry this was so negative. Keep on surviving, my friends.